Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 11th of November 2020. The news article to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now, before going to the analysis of today's DNS, please test yourself to these questions. The answers to these questions have been given at the end of the video discussion. Now, the first article appears on page number 7 and is titled as Employment Finally an Election Issue. This article becomes important both from the perspective of GS paper 3 as well as the essay paper. As you can see, in previous year mains, questions have repeatedly been asked with respect to the jobless growth of the Indian economy. Now, before we discuss various aspects of this particular article, let us first look into its background. If you look at the GDP growth rate of the Indian economy between the years 2003-4 to 2013-14, the GDP growth rate was as high as around 8 to 9%. In spite of the fact that the Indian economy experienced higher GDP growth rate, this failed to get translated into higher employment opportunities. So the nature of correlation between the GDP growth rate and the employment creation of the Indian economy has continued to remain weak. For instance, if you look at the employment elasticity of the Indian economy, according to various estimates, this stands at only around 0.1. This means that for every 1% increase in the GDP, the employment of the Indian economy increases only by 0.1%. Further, in case of India, on an annual basis, the total labor force is increasing by 2.2%, but the job creation of the Indian economy is increasing only by around 1.5%. So there is a large scale difference between the increase in the labor force and the number of jobs that we are creating. So because of this, if you have to bridge the gap between the labor force and the job creation, we need to create almost around 55 to 60 lakh jobs on an annual basis. Now the need to stress on the job creation arises because India, as you know, is facing the demographic dividend, wherein the share of the working age population in the year 2011, which was around 50%, this is set to increase to 59% by the end of 2040. So we have a small window of next 2 decades, that is from 2020 to 2040, in order to reap the demographic dividend. And in order to reap the demographic dividend, we need to create high paying, high productive formal sector jobs. But the problem of the Indian economy is not just in terms of number of jobs, but also the kind of jobs that we are creating. Because most of the jobs that we are creating are in informal sector. These jobs are low paying and low productive. So the failure of Indian economy to create jobs may well turn our demographic dividend into demographic curse. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the recently concluded Bihar elections. Now according to the authors of this particular article, so far during the elections, the political parties had not given due amount of emphasis on the employment creation. However, according to the authors, for the first time during the Bihar elections, various political parties promised a number of government jobs to the people. Accordingly, this particular article discusses various myths and reality related to the job creation within the Indian economy. See, the overall scope of this particular article is quite limited, wherein it focuses more about the employment creation in Bihar. Secondly, it focuses more about dispelling various myths related to the employment creation. Nevertheless, from the perspective of the UPSC examination, one needs to be aware about various aspects of the employment creation. That is why we will be discussing this particular article in much greater detail. The main question for the practice from this particular article could be the correlation between the GDP growth rate and employment elasticity has continued to remain weak in India. In this regard, give a reasoned account for the jobless growth in the Indian economy. See, as far as the jobless growth of the Indian economy is concerned, you should be able to identify as to what aspects become important from the perspective of the prelims examination and what aspects become important from the perspective of the mains examination. As far as the prelims examination is concerned, from the perspective of prelims, you should be aware about the basic terminologies related to employment and unemployment, various employment statistic reports such as the periodic labor force survey report, the various approaches used in order to measure the unemployment within the Indian economy. So all of these aspects which become important as far as your prelims is concerned, all of these aspects have been covered in our DNS dated 2nd of November 2019 by me. So you can go through this particular DNS in order to understand various prelims related aspects related to employment and unemployment. And as far as the UPSC mains examination is concerned, you should be aware about the nature of employment situation, the reasons for the jobless growth of the Indian economy, and what strategies should be adopted in order to boost the employment creation and reap the demographic dividend. So as part of this particular video analysis, we'll focus mainly on the mains related aspects about the employment creation. Let us start our discussion with respect to nature of employment situation, starting with the sectoral share of the different sectors in terms of their contribution to the employment creation. As you can see here, the agriculture sector contributes 16% of India's GDP, but yet it employs 45% of India's workforce. This clearly shows that there is high level of disguised unemployment in the Indian agriculture. When it comes to industrial sector, the industrial sector basically includes manufacturing, mining, electricity, and construction. Now, all of these four activities together comprises 30% of India's GDP, but yet they employ only around 25% of India's workforce. Particularly, if you look at the manufacturing sector, the share of the manufacturing sector to India's GDP is around 16%, and it employs only around 12% of India's workforce. The worrying factor here is the share of the manufacturing sector, which was around 16% in the year 1990s. This has remained same even in the year 2018. This clearly shows that there has been stagnation in the share of the manufacturing sector to India's GDP at 16% since the 1991 economic reforms. As far as the services sector is concerned, the services sector contributes the highest to India's GDP at 54%. But if you look at the employment opportunities created by the services sector is quite lower at only around 30%. This is primarily on the account of the fact that the services sector, particularly the sectors such as IT, BPO, telecommunications, etc., they require highly skilled workforce. And in case of India, we have not been able to provide the required skill set so that the more amount of employment opportunities are created in the services sector. The next concern is not just over the number of jobs that we are creating, but also the nature of jobs. See, if you have to reap the demographic dividend, the nature of jobs that we create, it should be high paying and high productive formal sector jobs. But the problem in case of Indian economy is the most of the jobs that we are creating, they are basically informal jobs, and these informal jobs tend to be low paying and low productivity jobs. Take for instance, 90% of India's workforce is presently considered to be informal workforce, and only 10% of the workforce is in the formal sector. Problem is related to the growing informalization of India's workforce. See, in our DNS dated 22nd of September 2020, we had discussed various problems and challenges with respect to labor laws in India. One of the important problems which we had identified then was lack of flexibility to the firms to hire and fire the employees. See, with respect to this particular problem, if the firms are hiring the permanent employees, then the firms would not have the necessary flexibility to hire and fire these permanent employees. Hence, in order to avoid this particular problem, most of the firms in case of India have started hiring contractual workers instead of hiring the permanent employees. This is so because on hiring the contractual workforce, the firms would have the necessary freedom or the flexibility to hire and fire these contractual workforce. Over a period of time, the share of the contractual workforce in the organized manufacturing This has increased from 12% in 1999 to 25% in the year 2010. Now the problem here is that these contractual workforce, they are given at least 20 times less salary as compared to the permanent employees. Moreover, these firms do not invest money in providing the necessary skill set to these contractual workforce, and this in a way in turns reduces our ability to reap the demographic dividend. Next, according to the International Labour Organization, most of the India's workforce, they are provided with less amount of wages, and moreover they do not have access to various social security benefits. Accordingly, ILO turns this people who are paid less wages and do not have access to social security benefits as the working poor. The next problem is related to the decline in the female labor force participation rate in India, which was identified by the Economic Survey 2019-20. As you can see here, the overall female labor force participation rate in the year 1993-94, this was around 45.2%, but by the end of 2017-18, this has got dropped down to 25.3%. Now, as compared to India, the female labor force participation rate in China is much higher at 61%. In USA, it is 56%. Moreover, the male labor force participation rate of the Indian economy is around 75%. According to International Monetary Fund, if the female labor force participation increases to match the male labor force participation rate, then overall GDP of India could well increase by almost around 27%. Now coming to second dimension as to why there is poor correlation between the GDP growth rate and the employment elasticity of the Indian economy. First and foremost, if you look at countries such as China, these countries have relied on the manufacturing sector to create more amount of employment opportunities. Unfortunately, in case of India, the manufacturing sector has failed to take off. This is evident in the fact that the share of the manufacturing sector to India's GDP has remained stagnant at 16% since the 1991 LPG reforms. Obviously, there are a number of reasons as to why the manufacturing sector has failed to take off. For example, one is because of lack of access to various factors of production, that is land, labor, capital, etc. The land acquisition in case of India, even today, it is considered to be quite cumbersome and time consuming. The failure to implement the labor reforms has also adversely affected the manufacturing sector. Moreover, the poor financial position of banks and NBFCs has also led to decline in the credit creation and thus has adversely affected the manufacturing sector. Apart from that, the cheaper imports from countries such as China, particularly in crucial sectors such as electronic industries, has also affected the domestic manufacturing. Apart from that, if you look at the logistic cost in case of India, the logistic cost comprises of almost around 12 to 14% of India's GDP. This is considered to be much higher as compared to 8 to 9% in other countries. The higher logistic cost in turn increases the prices of various goods that we export to other countries, and automatically the higher logistic cost reduces our export competitiveness. Some of the other problems include lack of ease of doing business, poor technology adoption, and so on. The second problem is with respect to lack of skill sets. You'll be surprised to know that only 13% of India's workforce are trained, and out of these 13%, 11% have got informal training, and the extent of the formal training is limited to only 2% of India's workforce. So unless we expand the overall formal training in India, we would not be able to create more amount of employment opportunities. The next reason for the jobless growth is the presence of the draft firms in the MSME sector, which is also referred to as the problem of missing middle. So what exactly is this problem of missing middle? So problem of missing middle means that in case of manufacturing sector, we have a large number of small size enterprises and few large size enterprises, but there is near absence of the medium size enterprises. This clearly shows that the small size enterprises have failed to grow into the medium-sized enterprises, or they have failed to grow into large-sized enterprises. The small-sized enterprises have continued to remain smaller in spite of the fact that they are quite old. So this is referred to as the problem of missing middle. Let us understand this in terms of the MSME sector. See, the government of India gives a number of incentives to the MSME sector. The idea is to nourish these MSMEs into the giant-sized industries. So if these MSMEs become giant size, automatically they will be in a position to optimally utilize factors of production, that is land, labor, capital. It will lead to higher productivity, it will create more amount of jobs, reap demographic dividend, and thus promote entrepreneurship at the grassroots level. However, the problem here is these government incentives are given to the MSMEs irrespective of their age. That is, irrespective whether an MSME is 1 year old or if it is 15 years old, all of these MSMEs would get these government incentives. Take for instance, all the MSMEs are basically exempted from various labor laws. Then the RBI has provided for the priority sector lending to the micro enterprises. Now, as per the RBI's guidelines, minimum 7.5% of the loans have to be given to the enterprises categorized as a micro enterprises. Now, the problem with such kind of incentives is that if this particular micro enterprises becomes a medium enterprise, or if it becomes a large size enterprise, then such a micro enterprise will not be able to get the benefits of the priority sector lending. So what this micro enterprise then does is it continues to remain smaller rather than grow bigger. Now, all such micro enterprises that have continued to remain small in spite of the fact that they are more than 10 years old, we refer to them as the draft firms. So these draft firms are more than 10 years old, they employ less than 100 people, and they have failed to grow into large size firms, because if they grow into large size firms, then they will lose out on all the benefits which the government basically gives them. Take for instance, under the public procurement policy, the government of India has mandated that minimum 25% of the procurement by various central ministries as well as central PSUs, these procurement would have to be undertaken from the micro, small and medium enterprises. So if an MSME becomes a giant industry, then such an MSME would lose out on the benefit of the public procurement policy. So the MSME would continue to remain an MSME and it would not grow into large size firm. So when the firms continue to remain smaller, obviously this will lead to low productivity as well as low employment creation. The next aspect is related to the accidental impact of government policies. So basically the industries need two factors of production, that is labor and capital. The governments at both central level as well as state level have been trying to provide the capital to the industries at a lower cost through various government schemes and programs. Take for instance the credit linked subsidy scheme. Under this credit linked subsidy scheme run by the central government, credit is provided to various industries at affordable rates. So most of the government schemes and programs are geared towards providing credit to the industries at a much lower rates. So because of this, what has happened is the overall cost of capital in case of India, this has got reduced. In comparison, the cost of labor has increased. So if you compare the two factors of production, because the government has emphasized more on providing capital to the industries at a lower cost, the overall cost of capital has reduced in comparison to the cost of labor. This in turn has incentivized the industries to focus more upon capital intensive industries rather than on the labor intensive industries. The next aspect obviously is obsolete and archaic labor laws, which we have discussed in much greater detail in our previous DNS video. Lastly, coming to the various strategies in order to boost the employment creation in the Indian economy. First and foremost, the Economic Survey 2016-17 has highlighted that the Indian economy needs to focus upon the labor intensive industries, particularly the industries such as textile and leather. The Economic Survey 2016-17 has also highlighted that if you invest same amount of money in the iron and steel industry and a textile industry, with a similar amount of investment, the textile industry can create 240 times more amount of jobs as compared to the investment in the iron and steel industry. Next, the Economic Survey 2019-20 has highlighted that the Indian economy needs to get integrated into the global value chains by focusing or integrating the assemble in India into make in India. By doing so, we would be able to create 4 crore jobs by the end of 2025. Thirdly, the Economic Survey 2018-19 had highlighted that the Government of India should limit its incentives only to the infant MSMEs, and incentives as such should not be given to the draft firms. Now, this essentially means that when the government gives incentives, the incentives should be given to the MSMEs only in first, say, around 1 to 5 years. Beyond 5 years, the MSMEs should not be able to get these government incentives. So beyond 5 years, these MSMEs would then be compelled to grow into large size firms. Nextly, as you all must be aware, recently the Parliament of India has passed all the 4 labor codes. These 4 labor codes have basically sought to consolidate the multiple labor laws and reduce the compliance burden on the firms in order to create more amount of employment opportunities. Going forward, there is a need to strictly implement these labor codes in order to boost the job creation. The next strategy is to promote the secondary agriculture as highlighted by the Dalwai panel on doubling of farmers' income. So what exactly is secondary agriculture? According to Dalwai panel, a secondary agriculture has to fulfill 3 criteria. First and foremost, it is a cottage-based industry that is located in a rural area. Such a cottage-based industry either provides inputs to the Indian agriculture or it uses the agricultural commodities as the inputs. Secondly, it uses the locally available skills or the resources. And thirdly, it can be categorized as a micro, small and medium enterprise. So in a nutshell, whenever you come across a manufacturing or a service sector enterprise located in a rural area, which can be defined as a MSME that uses the agricultural commodities as a raw material or it provides inputs to the agriculture, then all such activities can be considered as a secondary agriculture. Take for instance a manufacturing enterprise, that is a food processing industry that is promoted by the farmer producer organization. Similarly, we can consider a service sector enterprise wherein women in a rural area have come together and they are providing credit to the farmers. One of the biggest benefits of the secondary agriculture is that this will reduce the disguised unemployment that we normally see in the Indian agriculture and boost the employment creation in the rural areas. At the same time, this will also be able to reduce the distress migration that we normally see from the rural to urban areas. So obviously there are a number of benefits associated with boosting the secondary agriculture, and accordingly this has to be given due amount of emphasis. And coming to the last strategy, that is change in the orientation of the government's policy towards the special economic zones. As you all must be aware, the special economic zones have been set up in India basically in order to boost the exports. So whenever the industries are located in the SEZs, these industries are given incentives on boosting their overall exports. The overall idea of SEZs in India has basically been borrowed from that of China. Now, for example, China's first SEZ, that is Shenzhen, when it was initially started, it was actually a small fishing village. But within a matter of say around 25 to 30 years, this small fishing village has become now one of the world's largest cities. Unfortunately, in case of India, unlike China, the SEZs have continued to remain a failure. Neither they have been able to boost the exports nor they have been able to create the employment opportunities. Accordingly, the government appointed Baba Kalyani committee had given a number of recommendations as to how the government has to reorient its policies towards the SEZs. One of the most prominent recommendations of the Baba Kalyani Committee was to rename the SEZs as the 3 E's. That is, the SEZs should have to be renamed as Economic and Employment Enclaves. Now, this is not just the change in the nomenclature, but this is also a change in the purpose for which the SEZs would have to be set up for. So far, we were setting up the SEZs only for boosting the exports. Now, Baba Kalyani Committee feels that the SEZs, apart from boosting exports, they have to also boost the employment creation. Secondly, so far we were giving incentives to the units in the SEZs based upon how much they are exporting. According to Baba Kalyani Committee, this has to get changed, wherein the units located in the SEZs should also be given incentives depending upon how much of job opportunities they are creating. So if a particular unit in the SEZ is creating more amount of employment opportunities, automatically such a unit will get more amount of government incentives. So the overall change in the orientation of the SEZs is that we should not view the SEZs only as a tool for boosting exports. The SEZ should also be used as a tool for boosting the employment creation as well as the overall economic growth within the Indian economy. So these are some of the strategies which can be followed in order to boost the employment creation. Apart from these strategies, in case if you feel there are other strategies also that the government can possibly adopt in order to boost the job creation, please let us know your views in the comment section given below. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 6 in the form of an editorial and is titled as Dose of Optimism. Now this particular article shall be important from the perspective of science and technology, both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains. This particular article highlights that a number of biotechnology companies such as Pfizer, BioNTech, which is a German-based company, Moderna, all of these biotechnology companies are presently involved in the development of the mRNA vaccine for dealing with the COVID-19. Now, this concept of mRNA vaccines is considered to be a technological breakthrough as far as dealing with COVID-19 is concerned. So, let us understand the working mechanism, advantages and the concerns which have been raised with respect to the development of the mRNA vaccines. But before we get into the working mechanism, let us first brush up as to how the coronavirus affects the body and how the body's immune system responds to the COVID-19 virus. Now, as you all must be aware, a virus cannot reproduce on its own. In reality, the virus infects a cell, goes into its nucleus, hijacks its genetic material and then forces it to make more number of its own copies. Similar to that, if you look at how COVID-19 affects the body, the spike proteins that we associate with the COVID-19, the spike proteins get attached to the body cells, they bind to the body cells, and after binding to the body cells, the COVID-19 then injects the RNA into the cell, and this particular RNA, which carries the instructions for producing more number of copies of COVID-19 or the proteins, this RNA hijacks our genetic material and the cell, our body cell as such, start reproducing the COVID-19 virus. Normally, when any harmful microorganism enters into body, these harmful microorganisms produce special kind of proteins. These special proteins are referred to as the antigens. So whenever the antigens are produced in our body, this in turn triggers the body's immune system. So automatically when the body's immune system recognizes these antigens, in response the body's immune system produces the antibodies which are then used to target the harmful microorganisms. Now for example, let's say in case of COVID-19 virus, the spike protein could be a kind of antigen. So in response to this antigen, the body's immune system start producing the antibodies in order to deal with the COVID-19 virus. Now this particular response of the body's immune system is in turn used for the development of various kinds of vaccines. So in a way, the vaccines try to mimic the microorganisms so as to trigger the body's immune response, form the memory cells, so that in future if there is an attack by a microorganism, then the body's memory cells would be able to detect those microorganisms and immediately start producing the antibodies. Now take for instance, in case of the oral polio vaccine, we actually insert a weakened form of the polio virus. So this particular virus, when it enters into the body, this does not have the potential to cause infection, but it retains the ability to trigger the immune response. Similar to that, what can also be done in order to develop a vaccine for COVID-19 is that we can insert a weakened form of COVID-19 into a healthy human body. Since the COVID-19 virus as such is weakened, this will not be able to cause the infection, but it will be sufficient enough to trigger the body's immune system, leading to the formation of antibodies. Similar to that, instead of inserting the entire COVID-19 virus into the human body, we can insert only the spike proteins into the human body. So automatically when these spike proteins are inserted into the human body, then the body's immune system will get triggered, leading to formation of antibodies. So the first type of vaccine that we discussed was a kind of live or attenuated types of vaccines. Whereas the second type of vaccine which I described can be considered to be a form of a subunit type of vaccine, because here you are not inserting the entire virus, rather you are inserting a specific unit or a part of the virus. On a third level, let's say instead of inserting this actual spike proteins into the human body, what if we are able to insert instructions into the human body in order to form the spike proteins? So in the third case, we are not actually inserting the spike proteins, rather we are inserting the instructions to form the spike proteins that we associate with COVID-19 virus. Automatically, when we insert such instructions, spike proteins will be formed in the human body, and in response to formation of spike proteins, the body's immune system will get triggered, leading to the formation of the antibodies. So this is how the mRNA vaccine actually works. So let's discuss this in detail. See, if you look at the mRNA in the coronavirus, the mRNA actually carries codes for production of almost around 24 proteins. Now out of these 24 major proteins, one of the most important proteins happens to be the spike proteins, which form the outermost layer of the COVID-19. Now the spike protein is quite important because it is a spike protein that binds to the human cell, and from the human cell it inserts the RNA into the human cell, and this RNA in turn gives instructions to the human cell to produce different types of its own copies. So if you are able to form a strong immune system to deal with the spike proteins of the COVID-19, then in reality the COVID-19 will not be able to enter the human cell. In this regard, what basically the mRNA vaccine does is, it tries to identify as to what part of the mRNA of the COVID-19 is responsible for the development of the spike protein. So once we understand as to what kind of instructions does a COVID-19 issue in order to form the spike proteins, these instructions can be replicated on a much larger scale in a laboratory in order to produce the mRNAs that are associated with the production of the spike proteins. Now these mRNAs can then be injected into the human body either orally or through the syringe. So once this mRNA vaccine is injected into the human body, this will lead to the formation of the spike proteins. Once these spike proteins are formed, automatically this will trigger a body's immune system, leading to the formation of antibodies. So later on, when the COVID-19 actually enters into the human body, the body's immune system will be in a much better position to directly attack the COVID-19, and the COVID-19 as such will not be able to enter into the human cell. So this is how the mRNA vaccine actually works. Now there are a number of benefits associated with the mRNA vaccine. As discussed before, the vaccine could be either a live attenuated vaccine, or it could be a vaccine based upon a specific unit of coronavirus. In both of these two cases, we need to grow the coronaviruses in the lab through a cultured medium. Now this could be both costly as well as time consuming. Whereas in this particular case, that is the case of mRNA, we only need to know as to what instructions the COVID-19 issues in order to form the spike protein. Once you know the instruction, these instructions can easily be replicated even in the labs. Nextly, the mRNA vaccine is also considered to be less infectious as compared to the traditional vaccines. However, the technology that is used in the development of mRNA vaccine, this technology is considered to be quite advanced. That is why so far we have not been able to come out with any commercially approved mRNA vaccines. So the advanced technology that is needed for the development of the mRNA vaccines could be a kind of handicap. Secondly, these mRNA vaccines need to be refrigerated. They need to be stored at temperature as low as -80°C. In a country such as India, where there is acute shortage of cold chain infrastructure, making available the mRNA vaccines on a larger level to all the India's citizens, this could be more challenging. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to mRNA vaccines. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 6 and is titled as Strengthening the Public Health Capacities in Disasters. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 3 under the subsection Disaster Management. This particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the outbreak of COVID-19. This article basically highlights that the Disaster Management Act 2005 is not well equipped to deal with the health-related disasters such as the COVID-19. Accordingly, it highlights the flaws in the Disaster Management Act 2005, which has made it difficult to deal with the health-related disasters, and accordingly, it has given a number of suggestions and recommendations. Now, before we get into various aspects of this particular article, let us first understand about the legal and institutional framework to deal with the disaster management in India. As you all must be aware, the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution provides for the union list, state list and concurrent list. So through these lists, the Indian Constitution seeks to provide for the distribution of roles and responsibilities between the center and the states. However, please do note that presently there is no explicit entry for the disaster management under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So, accordingly, the Centre has formulated the Disaster Management Act 2005 by invoking entry 23 of the concurrent list. Entry 23 of the concurrent list basically deals with social security and social insurance, employment and unemployment. So by invoking entry 23, the Centre has invoked Disaster Management Act 2005. The primary responsibility of dealing with disaster is that of states, whereas the role of the Centre is that of a coordinator and a planner. The Disaster Management Act 2005 seeks to set up a 4-tier institutional structure to deal with the disasters. At the union level, that is at the apex level, we have the National Disaster Management Authority. The role of the National Disaster Management Authority is to lay down plans, policies, guidelines to deal with various kinds of disasters. The ex officio chairperson of National Disaster Management Authority is a Prime Minister. The National Disaster Management Authority is in turn assisted by the National Executive Committee. The National Executive Committee basically comprises of the secretaries of all the relevant ministries and departments. Apart from that, under the Ministry of Home Affairs, we have the National Disaster Response Force, which is a specialist force to deal with various kinds of disasters. Then we also have the National Institute of Disaster Management, which has been vested with the authority to develop the human resources to deal with different types of disasters. Just like the institutional structure at the central level, we do have the institutional structure at the state level. At the state level, we have the State Disaster Management Authority that is headed by the Chief Minister of the concerned state. The State Disaster Management Authority is in turn assisted by the State Executive Committee, which comprises of the ministries of the relevant ministries and departments at the state level. Then at the third level, that is at the district level, we do have the District Disaster Management Authority, which is headed by the district collector or the district magistrate. Below the district administration, it is a role of the individual panchayats and municipalities to deal with various kinds of disasters. Let us now look into various concerns raised in this particular article or the management of the health related disasters. First and foremost, the article highlights that the Disaster Management Act 2005 has not given due amount of emphasis on management of the health related disasters. It can be seen from the fact that there has been no adequate amount of focus on enhancing the medical preparedness to deal with the disasters such as the COVID-19. Most of the time, the government's reaction to deal with the COVID-19 was quite ad hoc as well as reactionary. See, when we adopted the Disaster Management Act 2005, the idea was to give up the ad hoc and reactionary policies to deal with the disasters and rather adopt more comprehensive and holistic policies to deal with the disasters. This should include the disaster preparedness, that is enhancing our preparedness to deal with the disaster, early warning system or the early warning mechanism, providing for the relief and rehabilitation, and in the long run improving our resilience to withstand various kinds of disasters. Now, most of the disaster related aspects in India have focused on aspects related to earthquake, floods, etc. But due amount of emphasis has not been given to the health related disasters. Secondly, as per this particular article, in order to deal with the health related disasters, the government of India is over relying on the private sector and it is relying less on the public sector. For instance, when the COVID-19 struck India, the government of India decided to rely on the private sector and it decided to cap the prices to be paid to the private sector hospitals. The problem with respect to over-reliance on the private sector would affect the 3 A's of healthcare, that is, it will affect the availability, affordability and accessibility of the healthcare, particularly for the people belonging to the poor and the vulnerable sections. So some of the problems of over-relying on the private sector include the overcharging by the private sector hospitals, lack of insurance penetration. So you must have heard about the hospital bills rising to more than 15 lakhs for around 4 to 5 days of ICU beds during the peak of the COVID-19. Then lack of affordability for the poor and the vulnerable sections, poor presence of private hospitals in tier 3 cities. In this regard, the article highlights that instead of over-relying on the private sector to deal with the health-related disaster, it is much better to enhance the public sector capacities to deal with the health-related disasters. And this can be done by inserting a provision under the Disaster Management Act 2005 to enhance the public sector capacity. This becomes altogether more important because if you look at the public expenditure on health as percentage of India's GDP, this is hardly around 1.5%, and accordingly there is a need to enhance this particular expenditure. Nextly, the article highlights that most of the time the Disaster Management Act 2005 tends to focus on those disasters that are quite sudden and disruptive in nature. For instance, it has focused more upon say floods, earthquakes, etc. And it has failed to realize that even some of the progressive events which may not be sudden, even they can turn into disasters in future. Take for instance the outbreak of dengue in a particular area. Now this is not sudden, this is progressive, but over a period of time this can spread to much larger area. The same can be said about the tuberculosis as well. So overall, the Disaster Management Act has not given due amount of emphasis on certain progressive events that can turn into disasters in future. So had we given due amount of emphasis on these progressive events which may turn into disasters, then accordingly we would have given more amount of focus on prevention, preparedness and response to such progressive events. And lastly, the article highlights that there is a need for greater integration between the Disaster Management Act and the primary healthcare, particularly in the rural areas. This is so because between the Disaster Management Act and primary healthcare, there are a lot of convergences and we can have a greater amount of synergies if there is a greater integration between the two. Take for instance both Disaster Management Act 2005 and the primary healthcare. Both of them focuses on prevention of diseases. So if there is greater amount of integration between National Rural Health Mission and the Disaster Management Act, wherein through the Disaster Management Act we are improving the disaster preparedness and resilience to deal with various diseases under the NRHM, then automatically we will be in a much better position to prevent the outbreak of diseases in the rural areas. Similarly, both Disaster Management Act and primary healthcare focuses on promotion of community participation, and this can be leveraged for engaging with the non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations for enhancing the awareness related to various health related aspects. Then lastly, through such integration, we would be able to carry out the surveillance of outbreak of diseases more efficiently. And once we are able to carry out the surveillance of the outbreak of diseases on a real-time scale, automatically our response to such outbreak would be much more immediate. So these are some of the important aspects which has been highlighted in this particular article. Apart from that, the Second Administrative Reforms Commission has given a number of recommendations in its report on the crisis management as to what kind of legal and institutional changes have to be made to the Disaster Management Act 2005 in order to improve the disaster management in India. Now, each of these points, which are the recommendations of the second ARC, it can be cited by you while writing an answer in the UPSC mains related to the disaster management. First and foremost, as highlighted before, there is no explicit entry for the disaster management under the Schedule 7 of the Indian Constitution. But to deal with the disasters, obviously we need both horizontal and vertical coordination between multiple government agencies and departments, both at the central and the state level. In order to ensure such kind of horizontal and vertical coordination, the second ARC has suggested that disaster management as a subject, it should be placed under the concurrent list in the Schedule 7. Secondly, the second ARC has also suggested that the Disaster Management Act 2005 should explicitly provide for the categorization of disasters at different levels of government. The second ARC feels that if you are able to categorize a disaster as a national disaster, the state disaster or a local disaster, then we would be in a position to determine as to which authority would be primarily responsible for dealing with a particular disaster. For example, if you are able to categorize a disaster as a national disaster, then automatically it will be the central government which should be primarily responsible for dealing with such a disaster. Similarly, let's say a particular disaster has been defined as a local disaster at a local level, then it will be the local authority to deal with the such disasters. Nextly, there should be a greater role of the local bodies, both Panchayati Raj institutions as well as urban local bodies under the Disaster Management Act 2005. Nextly, the second ARC has also suggested that there is a need to set up the Cabinet Committee on the Crisis Management at the highest level to deal with the various aspects of disasters. And lastly, the disaster management plan that is required to be formulated by the center, state as well as the local bodies. Such a disaster management plan, according to second ARC, should have explicitly two components. The first component should be about the long-term mitigation plan. As the name suggests, this particular mitigation plan should lay down as to what kind of policies would these governments undertake in order to reduce the impact of disasters. The long-term mitigation plan should also incorporate various aspects of disasters into its development planning as well. And the second aspect of this disaster management plan would be the emergency response plan. That is, what kind of emergency responses would these governments take when a disaster actually strikes. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. Now the next article appears on page number 1 and is titled as Prime Minister Modi seeks respect for the territorial integrity. Recently on November 10th, the 20th Summit of Shanghai Cooperation Organization Council of Heads of State meeting was held. This was the first SCO summit which was held in the virtual format, and this was the third meeting attended by India after it became the full-fledged member of SCO in the year 2017. While addressing the 20th summit, Prime Minister Modi has highlighted that as a non-permanent member of United Nations Security Council, India would work towards a reformed multilateralism. That is, as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, India would try to ensure that various international organizations such as the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, etc., they are more democratic and more representative. Apart from that, Prime Minister Modi, in an indirect reference to the Chinese involvement in the POK region, he has highlighted the need for the SCO member countries to respect territorial integrity and sovereignty of each other. Now, as far as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is concerned, from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains, one would be required to understand certain basic details about SCO, its significance and importance for India. Now, these aspects of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was covered by me in the DNS dated 17th of Jan 2020. So what I would do here is I would attach the previous DNS video for your revision. Governmental organization that covers almost up to 40% of the global population, and it accounts for almost up to 22% of the world's GDP. Now, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was founded in the year 2001 with some of the founding members, and these founding members were China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. Subsequently, in the year 2017, India and Pakistan, which were earlier the observer countries, were made the full-fledged member countries. Now, if you look at the membership of SCO, it is basically led by China and Russia, and hence it is considered to be a countermeasure to the US-led NATO. Now, under the SCO, there are two permanent bodies. The first permanent body is the Secretariat of SCO, which is located at Beijing, and the second permanent body is the Executive Committee of the Regional Anti-Terror Structure. The Regional Anti-Terror Structure has been formed by the SCO member countries in the year 2004 so as to counter the terrorism emanating in this particular region. Now, some of the observer countries of SCO include Afghanistan, Belarus, Iran and Mongolia, and the dialogue partners include Azerbaijan, Armenia, Cambodia, Nepal, Turkey and Sri Lanka. Now, with respect to member countries, observer countries and dialogue countries, please try to make a note of these countries since these countries can be asked in the UPSC prelims examination. Now, with respect to significance of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, now if you look at both Central Asia as well as South Asia, both these regions of the world face the common challenges of terrorism, extremism and separatism. Hence, in order to tackle the common challenges of terrorism, the Shanghai Cooperation members have set up the Regional Anti-Terror Structure in the year 2004. Now, building on the Regional Anti-Terror Structure, Indian government has mooted the idea of SECURE to be adopted by SCO, wherein according to the Indian government, the SECURE would stand for security for all the member countries, economic development of the member states, promoting the connectivity between the member states, unity among the member countries, respect for sovereignty of the member countries, and the environmental protection of the member states. Secondly, given the fact that the borders in Central and South Asia are porous and disputed, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization calls for a political and diplomatic settlement of the border disputes between the member countries. Thirdly, in order to promote connectivity between the member states, the SCO has emphasized on promoting the people-to-people contact between the member states. Now, as part of its endeavor, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has declared 8 wonders of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which basically include a list of 8 important sites from across its member states. Now, in case of India, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has included the Statue of Unity located on the Narmada River as one of the 8 wonders of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Lastly, in order to promote the economic integration between the member states, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has proposed for the setting up of 2 new international institutions. The first new international institution proposed is the SCO Development Bank, and this SCO Development Bank is proposed to be set up in order to counter the dominance of the World Bank. The second proposed institution is the SCO Development Fund, which has been proposed in order to counter the dominance of the IMF. Now, with respect to importance of SCO for India, first and foremost, SCO is considered to be extremely important for India looking from a security angle. Now, both South Asia as well as Central Asia is considered to be the hotbed of terrorism in the region. Hence, by actively engaging with the countries in South Asia and Central Asia through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India would be able to enhance the security cooperation. Secondly, looking from the security perspective, the active support of SCO is extremely needed in order to deal with the Afghanistan problem. Now, the future of Afghanistan looks extremely uncertain. On one hand, America wants to withdraw from Afghanistan, and at the same time, the American government is actively involved in the bilateral talks with the Taliban. So there is a greater amount of uncertainty over the future of Afghanistan. Hence, in order to deal with such kind of uncertainty, India would need the active support of SCO members, particularly countries in Central Asia as well as Russia and China. Secondly, as you all must be aware, India is an energy hungry country where it imports almost up to 80% of its crude oil requirements, apart from importing other fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas, etc. Now, presently, most of its energy security needs are met by importing these goods from the West Asia. However, looking at the present volatile security situation in West Asia, India needs to diversify its energy imports. And in order to diversify its energy, India needs to look towards the energy-rich Central Asian countries. Hence, by engaging with the SCO member countries, India would be able to enhance its energy security. Thirdly, we must also realize that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization provides us with a forum in order to sort out the bilateral issues of the mutual interest. For instance, India and Pakistan are presently not involved in any kind of direct talks due to the recent tensions. However, since India and Pakistan are members of SCO, this SCO platform in turn enables India and Pakistan to engage on a constructive basis and resolve their bilateral disputes amicably. Lastly, the membership of Shanghai Cooperation Organization is considered to be a gateway for India in order to enter the Eurasian market. Hence, by entering the Eurasian market, there would be a greater amount of economic integration between India and the Eurasian countries. For instance, recently, Russia has proposed for fast tracking of a free trade agreement which is proposed to be signed between India and the Eurasian Economic Union. It is to be noted that the Eurasian Economic Union is basically a free trade agreement which consists of countries such as Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Russia. So recently Russia has asked for India to fast track its FTA with the Eurasian Economic Union. So once the FTA between India and Eurasian Economic Union comes into picture, there would be a greater amount of economic integration between India and the Central Asian countries. Now this is what you have to know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now the answers to the questions that we had posed before the start of our discussion has been presented on your screen. As far as the answers to the question number 3 and question number 10 is concerned, we would want you to find out the answers on your own and respond in the comments section. Now coming to the question for the day, the answer for the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is C, that is 1, 3 and 4.